Welcome to the YouTube show Health Q, the place where our aim is to boost up your health motivation, to boost up your health morale so that you can look at the brighter side of your health problem and start working towards it. So friends, in today's video, we are going to talk about cerebral palsy. What exactly it is, why does it happen, what are the risk factors, what are the common impairments that a child suffering from cerebral palsy will have, and how it is managed. So if you are concerned and are interested in knowing more about cerebral palsy, do ensure you watch this video till the end. So now let's get started. What exactly is cerebral palsy? So as the name suggests, cerebral palsy can be broken down into two words, cerebral and palsy. Cerebral means brain and palsy means paralysis. So whenever there is paralysis of the body due to damage to the brain or injury to the brain, it is combined and called as cerebral palsy. So now comes the question, what causes cerebral palsy? However, there is no known cause for cerebral palsy, but in most of the cases it is figured out that cerebral palsy happens due to the damage of the brain, which could be before birth, during birth or after birth. As I said, there is no particular cause or reasons for cerebral palsy, but there are certain risk factors which put a child more prone to develop cerebral palsy in future. So what are these risk factors? These are premature birth, low birth weight, blood clotting problems, inability of placenta to provide developing fetus with oxygen and nutrients, blood type incompatibility between mother and baby, infection of mother with viral diseases, bacterial infection of mother, fetus or baby that can directly or indirectly attack the brain of the child, prolonged loss of oxygen during the pregnancy or birthing process, and severe jaundice shortly after birth. Now the next thing that we should need to know is what are the impairments associated with cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy does not have a cure and is a lifelong problem, and it hits a child with lots of impairment. This impairment has got a drastic impact on their quality of life. So what are these impairments? These are mobility issues, communication issues, pain, eating and drinking issues, poor saliva control, intellectual disability, learning difficulties, hearing impairment, vision impairment, behavioral and emotional well-being impairment, epilepsy, sleep issues, spinal and hip abnormalities, poor bladder and bowel control. So now the next question that arises is how does a cerebral palsy is diagnosed? Now cerebral palsy is a complex problem and it is very difficult for a doctor to come to the final diagnosis of cerebral palsy. So here what is needed is an accurate history taking process. Along with that, a very close attention on the signs and symptoms that a child shows. Some scans like MRI and CT scan and general movement assessments can be used to predict the level of severity of cerebral palsy as well as coming up with the diagnosis of cerebral palsy. So what does this history taking comprises of? So when a doctor meets a child suffering from cerebral palsy, they will take a detailed history, particularly focused on the birthing process, how the birthing happened, whether the baby was premature or was having low birth weight, whether the mother was having any kind of complication during delivery process. Did the child cry immediately after birth or not? And also the development process of that child. After taking history, they put a strong and close examination on what are the signs that child shows of delayed development and cerebral palsy. When a baby comes to a doctor, the signs that they look for are low muscle tone, unable to hold up his or her own head while lying on the stomach, muscle spasm or stiffness, poor muscle control, reflexes and posture, delayed development, feeding or swallowing difficulties, and prefer using one side of body over other. When a toddler comes for the diagnosis of cerebral palsy, the signs they look at are not being able to walk by 12 to 18 months, not being able to speak simple sentences by 24 months. These are some of the signs which are indicative of cerebral palsy symptoms. Once the history taking part is done, once the entire signs and symptoms has been ruled out, next is the physical assessment of a child. Physical assessment basically looks at the postural control of the baby or its child, the muscle strength of the baby or its child, muscle control, or is also called as the muscle tone of baby or child, nutrition level, and other overall physical assessment. Apart from this, doctor also prescribe some scans like MRI scan to understand what area of brain has been damaged due to cerebral palsy. So once all this assessment has been done, it's time to classify the cerebral palsy and categorize this child into what kind of cerebral palsy this child falls into. Now, based on what all areas of the body which are affected as well as what all brain areas has been affected, the child can be categorized in different type of CP. For example, spastic CP. Spastic CP means whenever there is involvement of the upper frontal side of the brain. Here, all four limbs of the body is impaired and shows a very typical muscle tone which is too tight, also called as spasticity. Next type of cerebral palsy is called as dyskinetic cerebral palsy. Dyskinetic cerebral palsy happens due to the inner part of the brain being involved. It is characterized by a child having lots of involuntary movements. The third type of cerebral palsy is ataxic cerebral palsy. Here, the lower side of the brain, also called as cerebellum, is impacted. Due to this, the child will have lot of shaky movements, at the same time will also show some tremors. Fourth type of cerebral palsy is the mixed cerebral palsy, where the child can show characteristic of two types of cerebral palsy altogether. This all depends on what all areas of the brain has been damaged. Next part of classification of cerebral palsy depends on what area of body is being affected. For example, quadriparesis or quadriplegia. Here, all four limbs of the body like both the hands and both the legs are impacted. The second type of cerebral palsy is called as spastic diplegia. Here, only the lower part of the body is impacted. The third type of cerebral palsy is hemiplegia. Here, only the one side of the body, which means either left or right side of the body is impacted. So now, since history is known, signs and symptoms have been ruled out, physical assessment has been done, MRI scan has been done, the child is classified in what type of cerebral palsy he or she is suffering from. Based on that, the prognosis on how well the child will develop will depend. Now comes the question, how these childs are managed. As I said, there are different types of cerebral palsy. The management also vary based on what all impairment that exists in that particular child. Mostly, the management of cerebral palsy is a multidisciplinary approach, depending on different impairments that child particularly shows and needs help in. Some of the professionals that are involved in management of a CP child are pediatrician, neurophysician, neurosurgeon, orthopedic surgeon, physiotherapist, occupational therapist, speech and language pathologist, etc. However, there are some specialists who is involved in management of cerebral palsy. Unfortunately, there is no permanent cure for this condition. But the management goal is to improve the quality of life of the child. And this is done with the help of multidisciplinary ways of management. For example, medical management comprises of use of Botox injection to reduce the muscle spasm. Surgical procedures are used in order to correct the deformities that are developed in the child, or else sometimes also to improve the muscle tone or reduce the tightness of the muscles. Physiotherapy focuses on improving the ability of the child to move and do the basic day-to-day mobility requirements. Occupational therapy particularly focuses on the functional activities of hand and some vocational tasks like eating, writing, drawing, all the activities that the child needs to fulfill in the day-to-day life. The goal of occupational therapist is to improve that. Speech therapy focuses on managing and improving the communication skill, at the same time improving the oromotor functions of the child. Behavioral therapy is also a very important part, since these kind of child are more prone to develop depression and anxiety issues. Dietary advice is also required for this kind of child to improve their overall nutrition levels. So as I said, there is no permanent cure for cerebral palsy, but that doesn't mean that there is no ray of hope. There are lots of examples in current world who are suffering from cerebral palsy, still are an accomplished individual in this world. Only need is to understand their requirements, be their strength, and help them grow in their life. So friends, this was a brief about cerebral palsy. I hope you find this video informative. If you have got any queries related to cerebral palsy, do ensure you mention them in the comment section below. If you like this video, hit that like button and press that bell icon so that you can get notified every single time I upload a new video. See you next week. Thank you.